The overcast sky was revealing a dull red light as if enveloped in viscous blood. More soldiers were dying, and multiple different demons appeared on the battlefield, slaughtering the coalition. After a volley of spears, dozens lay in pools of blood, their painful screams filling the battlefield. A nearby guard tightly grabbed the woman, trying to prevent her from risking her life. The woman asserted she could fight. Her magic surged, exuding an icy aura that shook off the guard's hand. Without looking back, she strode forward. As a member of the Holy City's witches, if she had to die, she would die on the battlefield. Just then, a clear rebuke came from the side of the battlefield. A person fell from the sky, appearing like a deity descending. She raised her long sword high. Her auburn hair, like fire, instantly ignited hope in everyone's heart. The blessed warrior of the Federation, the transcendent witch Acaris. Amidst the people's surprise, Acaris raised her heavy sword and swung it at the oncoming demons. At that moment, it seemed as if time had stopped, with the light appearing like the last shadows before dawn. When she opened her eyes again, all the demons had been slain. Acaris seemed to have exhausted all her strength. She kneeled on one knee, telling everyone else to go first. Someone in the crowd asked, "Where should we go?" Tears streamed down the blue-haired woman's face. Where should they go indeed? Even the last holy city had fallen under the attack of the demons. Tens of thousands had died, all their measures exhausted, yet they could not turn the tide of the battle. Acaris, summoning all her strength, stood up. She raised her huge sword, her voice resonating across the battlefield. She steadfastly told everyone not to give up hope, that they needed to cross the mountains and rivers and head to the wilderness to rebuild their home. People slowly left the city, prepared to go to this new land to survive. The blue-haired woman looked at the holy city. What had once been the most luxurious of cities was now plunged into chaos and disorder. She didn't know if continuous escape could change anything, but she took her party away from the crowd and hurriedly moved west. The experimental tower in the forest held critical magic stones and documents she had left behind. Behind them, a group of demons suddenly appeared. Apart from her guards, the rest had no combat power. A few knights heroically covered for them. From the initial dozens of people, only 3 remained. Her trusty chief guards didn't flee. It was a common belief in the holy city that witches were chosen by the gods, and those without magic were merely the soil to cultivate them. However, the chief guard and those who protected her, she saw courage and resilience. Under the protection of the chief guard, the woman finally arrived at the stone tower. She entered the secret chamber and found the red magic stone. Suddenly, the roar of demons came from outside the door. The woman knew she couldn't die here. She needed to take all her research results out. She injected magic into the magic stone, causing it to continuously emit a signal crying for help. She invoked all her magic, transforming it into a gush of frost. The demon lifted its spear, its arm rapidly expanding. The next moment, the coldly gleaming spearhead flew straight at her. She sealed herself away. She didn't know how long it had been. Her vision turned pitch black, and all sound disappeared. Her body no longer felt cold, as if she was wrapped in a bundle of soft velvet. It felt like she was not in a dark basement, but lying on a soft bed. The pain of being about to be pierced did not come for a long time. She tried to slowly open her eyes and suddenly heard a woman's voice, saying, "Your Highness, she's awake." She casting her gaze to her side, only to see a man enter her field of vision. Roland asked her how she was feeling, but the woman didn't answer. Instead, she asked where she was. Roland gently replied, "This is Border Town," and then introduced himself and the Witch Union. She tried to get out of bed but found herself completely weak. The woman was thinking, things were moving in a direction she didn't want to see. The Witch Union, Prince of Grey Castle, Border Town, what exactly had happened? Looking at the 3 witches in the room, she was happy to see her kind, but they all seemed to be subordinates of the man who called himself a prince. She took a moment to recall, her eyes wide in disbelief. The title prince was a very old title, a secular title from the time of the first divine battle 400 years ago. She thought she had gone back in time, that the gods had given her a second chance to prepare and save the holy city and its people. Everyone in the room stared at the woman, but she didn't answer Roland's question. Roland thought the woman was just tired and wanted to let her rest for the night. She suddenly sat up and asked, "What happened to the demons? What happened to Takira?" After a series of questions, everyone in the room showed expressions of joy and excitement. Wendy asked her if she was really from 450 years ago. Rather than answering Roland, she was more willing to answer this witch. She said her name was Agatha, a witch from the Exploration Society of Takira. But she was surprised to hear Wendy ask her if she was a witch from 450 years ago. She wondered if they'd been fighting the demons for 450 years after she had fallen asleep. At this point, Roland told her that she had been asleep for a long time and the world had changed a lot. He could tell her slowly. But the woman ordered Roland to tell her now with a commanding tone. Agatha thought the prince was extremely rude. How could a mortal be so presumptuous to sit by her side and talk to her? But she needed to know what had happened. Roland smiled and wasn't angry at Agatha's rudeness. Roland began to explain the history of Grey Castle and the Four Kingdoms. When Agatha heard that self-proclaimed kings and nobles had become rulers stepping on the heads of witches, she couldn't help but interrupt him. How could witches possibly be hunted? Who would have the audacity to do such a thing? In her anger, Agatha wanted to stretch out her hand and teach this nonsense-talking man a lesson, but she found that her magic power could not be converted into frost as usual. It was then that she realized that there was a metal ring on her ankle, and it actually had a god's stone of punishment. She looked incredulously at the witches in the room, angrily scolding, how could they violate the Witch Federation's order to use this banned item? Roland sighed, he was afraid this would happen. Wendy sat on the edge of the bed, pulled the blanket back over her, and gently explained to her that what the prince said was true and that Takira no longer existed. The organizations she mentioned were also unknown to them. It was Prince Roland who had saved the witches, provided them with a safe place to live, and was researching how to better use their abilities to transform the world and live freely like ordinary people. After listening to Wendy's account, Agatha was completely silent. The Federation was a large organization established by several witch kingdoms. They won the first divine battle and were responsible for training and dispatching witches. Such a powerful organization, and now there were people who hadn't heard of them. The woman thought to herself, where have Icarus and the others gone? She couldn't believe that in the world now, witches could be enslaved and hunted. Wendy seemed to notice her discomfort and brought her a warm drink. Although everyone was kind to her, Agatha didn't understand why a group of witches were vigilant and guarded against her, even restraining her with a god's stone of punishment. She sighed. She knew she had to gain their trust first, so she shared her story. When Roland heard that Agatha had fought against the demons, Roland was somewhat surprised. Agatha frowned, looking annoyed at Roland. This unreasonable man had interrupted her again and asked even more questions. Scroll asked Agatha if she was a witch of the church, and Agatha impatiently replied that she had never heard of the church. Roland asked Scroll to hand that diary to Agatha. Agatha said that the text was created by the Federation so that ordinary people couldn't understand it and wouldn't be able to get involved in upper-level affairs. But the witches could understand it simply by using their magic. Roland commented that text and language are tools for communication and doing so was indeed foolish. Agatha was so angry, if it were not for her inability to use her powers, she would definitely teach Roland a lesson. He was too impolite. She was not used to ordinary people pointing fingers in front of her. Scroll asked Agatha again if she recognized the name Icarus, and Agatha's hand trembled slightly as she asked Scroll where she had heard the name. Upon hearing Scroll's response, Agatha hurriedly turned to the last page, sighed deeply, and remained silent for a long time. The image of a woman holding a long sword and slaying all the demons surfaced in her mind again. She said Icarus was a queen, one of the 3 seats of the Federation. She was a high-ranking transcendent witch, which means she was above the extraordinary witches. Even among the many blessed warriors in the Federation, she was the most powerful one. No one in the room had heard of these terms. Agatha closed the diary and explained that a witch's powers keep increasing from the moment of their awakening and solidify on their coming-of-age day. However, this is not the end point of their power. Through their understanding, feelings, and practice, a very small number of lucky ones can advance further, which the Federation calls high-order awakening. Roland thought for a moment and understood what Agatha meant. She meant witches have the ability to evolve their skills. Roland counted his fingers and said that 4 witches in the Witch Union had evolved their abilities now. This statement almost choked Agatha. She asked how many people were in the Witch Union, and Wendy said there were about a dozen. Agatha seemed somewhat annoyed. It was impossible that 4 people out of a dozen could awaken to a high order. She thought that Roland and the others were speaking nonsense because they didn't understand. The prince saw her disbelief and called Anna over. Agatha looked at the beautiful and calm girl, but she was still too young, and it was impossible for her to achieve a high-order awakening. She sees an orange flame appear in Anna's palm. Agatha quickly evaluated it. This is a fire-based magic ability, rare but not special. As soon as the words were spoken, the flame suddenly dimmed and turned into a wisp of gloomy green flame. Roland explained that this was her ability solidified at becoming of age. Soon, Agatha saw an incredible scene. The green flame disappeared, replaced by a black cube. It no longer looked like a flame, but more like a lightless metal cube. Its sides were smooth and flat, with distinct edges and corners, standing quietly in the witch's hand. Roland turned to Agatha and asked whether this was the high-order awakening she was mentioning. Agatha was at a loss for words for a moment. The only thought she had was, how did this happen? The holy city of Takara was forgotten, the Federation was annihilated. Without specialized training and guidance, witches' powers should have greatly regressed. But this young witch was able to undergo a high-order awakening. Moreover, the annoying prince mentioned that there were 3 others who had also achieved this. Agatha blankly stared at Roland, and it took her a while to regain her composure. For the first time, her arrogance disappeared. Agatha addressed Roland with a respectful manner, asking Roland about Anna's awakening experience. Roland patted Anna's head and explained that the first time was when her magic power was exhausted in a battle against demonic beasts. The second time occurred while learning new knowledge. Agatha wanted to ask what kind of knowledge, but Roland interrupted her, telling her they would talk about it later. What he wanted to know now was what the experiments written in Acris's diary about the God's punishment army. Putting her emotional turmoil aside, Agatha began to explain the contents of the diary. She said Acris was extremely powerful. Even with the God's punishment stone, she could stand her ground against several demon lords. She commenting that there were too few transcendent individuals. A better way to put it is that they lost in terms of versatility of witch abilities. Roland thought to himself. Understanding that not all ordinary people could awaken, not all who awakened could fight, and not all who could fight could become stronger. Agatha gently touched the diary and said, and this was the reason why they formed an army composed of ordinary people, but ordinary people were still too weak, unable to contend with the endlessly powerful demons. Under such adverse circumstances, Acris ordered them to start researching ways to empower ordinary people, allowing them to break the limits of the human body. Judging from what was written in the diary, it seems she succeeded. When Roland asked Agatha whether she, being part of the research group, knew the result, Agatha admitted that she had left the group after this order was issued and built her own experimental tower in the hidden forest. She hesitated for a moment before she revealed, the research group used the power of the God's punishment stone to forcibly combine witches' power and ordinary people, but this process required the sacrifice of the witches' lives. She couldn't accept such an experimental approach. Roland and Tilly were taken aback by the response. Seeing the sympathy and shock on Roland's face, Agatha felt less guarded towards Roland. With sorrow in her voice, the Federation is gone, and these experiments have disappeared as well. Roland interjected, telling her the God's punishment army still exists. This made Agatha's fingers stiffen as she incredulously stared at the prince. Roland, not knowing how to break it to her, slowly explained, an organization called the Church now established the Holy City. They initiated the witch hunt and continue to search for orphans to take back to the monasteries in the Holy City. The Church has its own armies and territories, the most powerful warriors among them being the God's Punishment Army. Beyond that, they also possess a group of powerful witches. Roland went on to explain why he had given Agatha the God's Punishment Stone, admitting he had been unsure about her origins at the time. Agatha was in shock. An organization composed of ordinary people had stolen the Federation's most important secret, and then turned around to capture witches and create the God's Punishment Army. Seeing her fatigue and discomfort, Wendy gently laid her down on the bed for rest, and removed the God's Punishment Stone from her foot. As everyone turned to leave, just as he was closing the door, Agatha heard a calm and steady phrase, "One thing you were wrong, ordinary people can defeat demons too." Back in his office, Nightingale reported that Agatha had fallen asleep and had eaten dinner, and now it was Sylvie's turn to watch over her. When Nightingale asked Roland if he believed Agatha's words, Roland expressed his intention for Nightingale to discern if Agatha was telling the truth the next day, but he believed most of what Agatha said was true. What surprised Roland was that Agatha, coming from over 400 years ago, used the same language and writing as they did, while the history of the major kingdoms was only around 300 years. If it was the Federation that led the survivors to escape to this land, then everything made sense. Nightingale looked at Roland with a smile, suggesting a wager. If Roland guessed wrong, he would owe her a luxurious lunch. Roland asked what if Nightingale was wrong. To which Nightingale tilted her head, saying Roland could ask for whatever he wanted.
Oh my God!
Roland forced his gaze away from Nightingale's perfect figure and back to the papers. He needed to sort out the information provided by Agatha. Suddenly, Nightingale mentioned, "Agatha doesn't seem to like Roland very much." Roland chuckled, not particularly concerned. He understood that Agatha once lived in a world where witches were superior to ordinary people, so in her eyes, Roland probably held no more significance than a weed by the roadside. When Nightingale asked if Roland didn't resent her for this, Roland shook his head. He had no reason to despise a pitiful person abandoned by time, who had slept in an ice coffin for over 400 years only to wake up to a completely different world. The unfamiliarity and fear would be present in anyone in such a situation. He knew that one day Agatha would gradually change her perspective. Nightingale smiled. This was the Roland she knew in her heart. When Agatha woke up again, the room was empty. She flexed her fingers and found that her strength had mostly returned. As she called on her magic, a sudden chill overflowed from her fingers. She walked to the window and lifted a corner of the curtain. The outside world was pitch black. When she opened the window, the cold wind instantly blended into the room. She was thinking about Roland's words today, wondering what kind of changes had occurred. Suddenly, a voice behind her asked if she was cold. Startled, Agatha turned around to see a woman sitting on the edge of the bed. Agatha looked at the door, it was closed, and she hadn't heard any footsteps. Nightingale introduced herself. Agatha frowned and asked if Nightingale was also a high-order witch. Nightingale thought for a moment, then understood Agatha was asking if she had evolved her abilities. Nightingale shrugged, said she wasn't as smart as Anna. The formulas and theorems in the books made her head spin. Agatha was stunned. Each word was understandable, but when strung together, they made no sense.
Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Remembering the prince's words, she asked Nightingale if she could see the book. Nightingale smiled and told Agatha that she could if she joined the Witch Union and served His Highness. Agatha's eyes widened, and she exclaimed, "How is it possible to serve a mere human?" Calling Nightingale gone mad. Nightingale was curious why Agatha came to this conclusion. Agatha replied proudly, she was once considered an oddity because in the holy city of Takira, most witches would only treat ordinary people as lowly servants, or even tools for reproduction. Although Agatha herself did not see it that way, she still thought ordinary people were stupid, but she believed through education, they can be changed. She taught them to learn and think, and handed over her work to the common people. However, the idea that the witches of the Federation would recognize a mere human as their master was too crazy to her. Nightingale shrugged and said that His Highness didn't regard them as servants. The truth was that he had taken in witches, allowing them to practice their magic and evolve into new powers, and allowed everyone to live in peace with the citizens. Together, they built the city and fought against their enemies. Agatha argued that this model has been proven to be a failure. During the first divine battle 900 years ago, humans and witches co-governed and were utterly defeated in the face of the demons' attack. This was the first time Nightingale had heard about this, and Agatha mocked them for their lack of knowledge about the demons. She warned that the third divine battle is in the corner and it's imminent and there is not a single safe land left in the world. Agatha believes that the Federation should be re-established, witches should be united, and then using what Roland described as the probability of high-order awakening through knowledge, to fight the demons. Nightingale didn't respond to Agatha's words, but continued to ask why she think that way. Just as Agatha was about to speak, Nightingale interrupted her. Nightingale didn't understand why Agatha couldn't let go of the notions from over 400 years ago. His Highness also mentioned that ordinary folks can defeat the demons, not just witches. His Highness wants to unite every ordinary person on the continent. Agatha was about to refute such nonsense, but Nightingale stepped closer to Agatha, asking her to lower her guards and let go of her arrogance, then confirm it with her own eyes. This time, Agatha's silence lasted for a while. She could tell that Nightingale didn't like her. Many witches from the Exploration Society often looked at her the same way, simply because she employed a group of ordinary people as assistants. She didn't understand why Nightingale, who didn't like her, would come and talk to her. Nightingale simply said that if Agatha could let go of her arrogance and treat His Highness normally, she wouldn't dislike her. She paused for a moment, adjusting her hair, and told Agatha that His Highness had said he didn't want to see Agatha being abandoned by the times again. In the Holy City, Oberlin sat on the throne, gazing at Maine, who knelt on the ground. Oberlin's voice had become weaker. Maine stood up straight and sought his wrinkled face and his fatigue. Oberlin looked at Maine, knowing that his time was near. He had called for Maine today to pass on the position of Pope to him. Maine wanted to speak, but was interrupted. The guards serving the Pope helped him onto a trolley. Maine followed closely and entered the basement of the cathedral. Oberlin asked Maine to continue pushing him. Maine took the handle and pushed the Pope into the wooden door. The wooden door closed behind them again, leaving only the soft glow emitted by the yellow crystals in the room. Beside the crystals were hung different portraits, and they came to Oberlin's portrait. Maine recognized that all these portraits were previous popes. The archbishop listened to Oberlin's summary, while looking at the portraits, but a strange unease lingered in his heart. The people in the paintings were too realistic. As they passed halfway through the hall, Maine suddenly noticed that the characters in the paintings had turned into women. They had different faces and were dressed differently, but they were all too beautiful. Directly across the central aisle of the hall was a full-body portrait that occupied the entire wall. It hung behind the prayer table, surrounded by glowing crystals. When his gaze fell on the painting, he felt his heart jump. Maine found it hard to find words to describe the woman in the painting. Her red hair was like a burning flame, and the cold light in her hand was uncontrolled. She stood with her sword, her eyebrows slightly raised, and her eyes looked down. Maine struggled to turn his head, only to find that Oberlin had already knelt down. Oberlin bowed his head and said, "She was the first pope, the transcendent, Acarus." Maine's heart jumped. His previous guesses were indeed entirely correct. The early portraits of the popes were all witches. He couldn't understand why the founder of the church would be a witch. Oberlin didn't answer his question, but asked Maine to bow. After Maine completed the ceremony, he helped Oberlin back onto the trolley. Oberlin called Zero's name and asked her to take Maine to another room. Maine was somewhat confused, wondering how witches could be here. Zero went to the prayer table, and magical light flashed. Then she took a pendant from the Pope's neck and opened the door behind it. Maine followed Zero into the room. Looking at Zero's various rude behaviors, Maine thought that once he took control of the church, he would definitely make Zero understand the rules she must obey. Zero lifted a hidden panel on the wall, pressed her hand on the magic stone, and Maine sat down. Zero said this was the first time she activated this thing. Maine held his breath, and everywhere he could see was black. Suddenly, the ground lit up again. Maine incredulously watched as one by one lifelike female figures appeared in his field of vision. They were dressed in gorgeous robes, sitting around a long table, and sitting at the head of them was the first pope, Acarus. The witch next to her reported that the God's Punishment Army experiment had been successful. Some people knew that such experiments would cost the lives of witches and raise doubts, while some people did not care. Soon, both sides started to argue. Acarus said softly, "Enough." Although her voice was very low, the scene instantly quieted down. Acarus said that humans cannot defeat demons. They can do nothing and wait for the next demon invasion, or they can make a last bet and pin their hopes on the God's Punishment Army. She asked the witches present to make a choice, whether to give up resistance or to make an all-out effort. Maine stared intently at this illusion, and the shock in his heart was beyond words. He finally knew the true history. The conversion ceremony of the God's Punishment Army was actually invented by witches. In order to defeat the demons, they did not hesitate to use their own kind as sacrifices. No one gave up. The witches who raised doubts just smashed the table hard. The witch next to Acarus said that no matter how many witches are sacrificed in the conversion ceremony, new witches will always appear to replace them. The more humans, the more witches. When asked if the God's Punishment Army can really defeat the demons, even Acarus did not know the answer. But Acarus's style of doing things is that even if there is a slight possibility, she will do her best. Everyone stood up and saluted Acarus. The next step is to convince the other members of the Federation. An older witch said that many witches would not agree. If they want to implement the God's Punishment Army's conversion without resistance, witches cannot exist as privileges above all. The Federation must be disbanded, and everything that has happened in the past must be completely buried. The image disappeared quickly, and Maine returned to reality. Zero came over, and Maine asked her to open the door. They walked out of the secret room. Maine staggered out of the illusion room. It took Maine a long time to calm his breath, finally knowing the origin of the church. In the end, Acarus led her witches to defeat the witches from the other two cities and achieved victory, establishing new rules. Witches are no longer the chosen people above all, but the evil ones who are tempted and fallen by the demons. Acarus died together with another transcendent witch not long after establishing the church, and the second pope inherited her will until all other factions were subdued. Ordinary people who did not want to participate in the witch war took root in different places and later formed civilization as the four major kingdoms known today. The witch war suffered severe casualties, thus they were unable to unify the continent. Oberlin said Acarus died too early. Acarus's close friend Natalia did not accept Acarus's plan, and according to the history book, she attacked Acarus during the meeting, but in the end, both of them died together. Oberlin said that if Acarus were alive, the witch war could end 50 years earlier, and all the witches would be included to unify the continent at that time. After a moment of silence, Maine asked a question. He didn't understand why the previous popes were all witches, but later all became ordinary people. Oberlin asked Zero to leave the room first. Only then did Oberlin speak, saying it was because of cowardice and fear. Maine couldn't believe what he was hearing.